joining today, Monica, and to pursue the exploration of deep learning in a shallow world. And I wondered if you could introduce yourselves to everybody that's joined and share your story, a little bit of your story and your background, and about learning design, education, motherhood, and how all of those have taken you a bit to where you are now.
For sure. Well, I am an instructional designer, passionate for designing e-learning, because I discovered this in the early this century, 2022, perhaps. 2002, I mean, not 2022, 2002. So I discovered it, and I thought, gee, this is what I want to be doing. Because when I started learning about teaching, it was very hard for me, the classroom management and the 30-minute periods that we used to have with our students. In higher ed, it's a little longer. You have 45, 90 minutes sometimes. But still it was difficult, that classroom time management. But in e-learning, you have a lot of time. You have 24 hours, 7 days a week. You post something in the discussion forum and you can go back to it several times during the week. And that's my style. That's deep learning. It's not what you can do in a very little amount of time, but it's what you can keep on exploring and rethinking about your ideas. And if I start going back to why I think like that and believe in learning like that, I can go back to high school perhaps. When I graduated, I was so scared to go out to the world, and because I thought that the only thing I knew was memorize and write things down in the paper. I didn't feel competent in anything after high school. But that feeling, now that I reflect on that, I think I just didn't know that I knew that I was critical and that my mindset was different. Because I can say that through all my school time, I learned different. I was perhaps pondering things more than my colleagues, my learners, my co-learners, my peers. I never really got into the learning style of schools that you need to do things because it's an assignment and that's it. I was always into trying to get something out of that. And that lifestyle perhaps moved into when I went to university and then when I had children. I didn't want my children to learn the tricks of school that all children unfortunately turn into, right? It's just schoolwork and it's just a grade and that's it. And then they forgot after they passed to the next grade, they forgot what they learned in the previous grade. So I homeschooled. I wanted my children to have that experience of pondering about what they were thinking about their thinking, having time to realize what they were figuring out, because that's something beautiful about the learning theory that I later started discovering, right? That learning is about sense making. And how do you make sense of things in a rush? For me, it's not possible. I need to have the time to actually be there with whatever I'm trying to make sense of and actually be there, right? Like when we talk about prestancing, be there and go deep into what that thing is telling me and that I am figuring out, etc. So that's why I chose homeschooling. I needed my children to go into that exploration of their own thinking and their own learning. And I remember that, of course, family members were not in favor of it, and they were telling me, look, but they need to learn about the rush of life. How are they going to then perform in this world that goes so fast? And I said, that's exactly what I don't want them to learn. This fast way of living. But another thing that I like is the balance. And I really thought to myself, well, it's true. They also need to perform in this fast way of living, right? So it's balance again. We had our rush moments. They went to karate lessons, for example, or swimming lessons. And so there were times when they needed to be ready for a specific moment, and there was a little bit of rush. But most of the time, it was this time for themselves to play, to engage in whatever they wanted to do in the garden, whatever they were surprised with, right? So those are the elements that I believe are the ingredients of deep learning. And that's why we have a shallow world right now, because we've been taught to put that aside because there's no time, right? And that's something interesting that we need to begin building into the new way of designing learning. That's what I'm trying to do with my instructional design.
So if we, I think we can park that point for a minute because I think we're going to revisit it through some of the other questions I've got lined up. But I think it'd be interesting for people joining to hear a little bit about Guatemala and the kind of educational systems there, because it seems like in a way you're probably a bit of a pioneer there with electronic learning and doing stuff online before it went mainstream with COVID, as it were. But I think it would be good to hear just a bit more about the educational system there in Guatemala and put people in touch with some of the realities there.
Sure, yeah. So you're right. We started at the university with these online learning very early in this century, and it was something completely new. I was invited to learn about this by one of my mentors. She was teaching at the university as well, and she discovered online learning with an online program actually, and brought it to the university and grabbed like 3 or 4 of her best students, also friends, and shared it with us. And then we decided that we needed that for the university and for other settings. And that's how I started my own virtual school for parents. I said I need to share many things that I know about learning with those lay people in education, like parents who are accountants, who are in medicine, whatever. They don't know about this theory of learning that I have learned. And I had just done brief course on, it was not a brief course, I had attended a conference on neuroscience for the learning process in preschool years. So all these were very new things in Central America and my country that began to plant a seed, perhaps, in small networks. But I kept the hope that in doing e-learning, we could preserve these ideas that I was talking about of sense making, community learning, conversational learning, lots of exchange, lots of opportunity to learn from one another and not in isolation, because that's what e-learning started to sound to people. Oh, that's being on your own, because we're not getting together in a classroom. We're so isolated in our space. And that's something that we do need to work as instructional designers and teachers. I never felt alone when I was learning in my online initial courses, because when I logged in, I could see other people logged in, and when I posted something in the discussion forum, sometimes I would have immediate response to what I had placed. So it was sometimes 11 p.m. and I was not feeling at all alone in my learning process, right? So these are the things that we need to preserve, because what has been changing that I've seen is, again, we're bringing the shallow learning that is common in the learning settings into the e-learning space. So in Guatemala, it's e-learning is new, but I've been connected with e-learning networks since I started, right? And something that has been just surprising me is that when I first read the newsletters, they were talking about how to help learners with the retention of content. And that always surprised me, because I was coming from this other end of social connection and learning from each other. So content retention was never my goal in helping people learn. And I was surprised to see that this was the goal with the learning. Now, 10 years afterwards, the newsletters that I get, the training that is being offered is coaching for skill development, right? In Guatemala, and I just gave a lecture to, it's not a lecture, it was an opening ceremony in the school where I'm working right now. And I was telling them, look, the opportunity for Guatemala, because it's so incipient, this e-learning is very new. And of course, COVID brought it fast, but then people started doing what they were doing face-to-face, now on Zoom or through video conference. And that's not learning. Now we need to go back and we teach people now that they have experienced it. And that's something that also makes me a little bit of sad, because learners now, I've heard from children that I'm close to, they hate it, right? Because they have to be sitting in front of the screen for the longest time. And e-learning is not that. E-learning is exploring. E-learning is coming together and sharing with your partners what you have been doing offline, probably. Not everything is digital. So that's what I was sharing in this opening with the students and the people in the university, that we need to make this type of e-learning more contextual, more connected, the opportunity of not making the same mistakes that others have already done, and to take the leap into a new kind of e-learning for Guatemala, because it's so new, but we can avoid what others have already learned that does work, and start doing it as we actually are, very connected, very communitarian. And I was sharing with Dave the other day something that I'm very fan of is Barbara Raga and her theory in cognitive apprenticeship. And she actually came to Guatemala to discover how our girls learn to weave. Guatemala is famous for her weaving in the indigenous communities. And she was intrigued to learn how girls learn to weave. She thought there were schools, weaving schools. And they learn from their mothers. They learn when they are very little. And they start playing with the strings and the little weaving tools that they use as toys. And that's how they start learning, by observing the model and trying to do it on her own. And then the mother is very attentive to whatever the child is doing and kind of gives her challenges to do with the weaving. So it's that play or dance, if we can say, in the teaching and learning that happens, that Barbara Rogoff tells it's the learner who decides what she or he needs to learn and kind of asks for it, which is completely the opposite of what happens in schools and the learning programs. It's the teacher comes and says, okay, today we're learning this and this and that. So there's the shallowness there because, okay, you tell me what I need to learn and I'll learn, and that's it, right? It doesn't come from the inner need. I really want to do this. I really want to see how you do it and be able to do it the same way. That comes from the inner need of being capable of something.
Monica, when we were exploring this in the beginning, I think because you've got a natural inclination and interest in e-learning, or that's what drew you in and made you the educator you are, but in a way it's not what most people would associate with deep learning, because sort of deep learning occurs in groups and with other people together, or that would be an assumption that it's embodied and enacted together. That's what helps create deep learning. Can you illustrate how you're able to do that through the digital learning? Can you explain a little bit in a bit more detail for us?
Yeah, I think embodiment is definitely the key for deep learning, right? But embodiment to me also has to do with learning to be able to do something, right? So my designs are always about having learners do whatever we want them to learn, and not teaching them first the concepts as they usually do, right? First the theory and then the practice, but it's making the practice be the trigger for finding out the theory, right? For finding out what I need to know to be able to do this. So there's the first embodiment, because there's movement. Even though they can't be working on a project that is written down, they just need to do research and perhaps design something. There is a movement in a way of their whole thinking, of their whole habits, of their whole figuring out. It's very active. And that's another difference that we need to make in learning, because what has been understood as active learning is doing a lot of activities, right? That not necessarily get this movement of cells, of neurons, of ideas, of connections, right? And even if it's, you were mentioning this need of co-creation, of engaging with other person. I was thinking maybe it's good. Obviously, it's a great part of learning is this exchange, but it can also happen with sessions that are recorded, like the ones that you use, for example, right? Yes, there it's the interaction with the person that is sharing his or her ideas, and then the learner doing that exchange on his own, perhaps. But it's that exercise of feeling the ideas of the other person, letting those ideas resonate, and react in a non-reactive way, if we can use that expression. It's produce new things out of that exchange. One exchange that is sort of one way because it's a video recording, or it can be an article, it can be many things. But it's helping the learner, again, really be present with whatever they are letting come in to their thinking, work it, right, and then let it come out again in a different way,
So,
and focusing on the process.
well, that's an interesting point you're making, because I think that some of us in the learning community here are focused on the inner development goals, which I know you're familiar with. But many students, if they're schooled in the absorb information and repeat information kind of paradigm, find that task, or what resonates, what motivates you, what are you interested in, they're actually already well down the route of just being a passive recipient of learning. So what do you do to create, so the learner has the energy or the vision or the kind of passion to engage from themselves with it? What do you do to elicit that from your students?
They need to do something, and they need to reflect on whatever they're doing. So I've worked with different settings. For example, if you are, I was helping with this ethics course that is mandatory in many organizations. You have these ethics courses that people need to take and check. But we actually want people to embody those norms, of course, because that's what they do in the organization, to engage with one another and have harmony in a way. So again, it's reflecting on what they are doing. We would have scenarios where the different rules perhaps were not observed, and then we would have them connect with the ethics code and say, well, what's happening in this scenario is that people are, not doing or not observing this and this rule, and then reflect on their own process, right? If you were that person, what would you have done, or what would you be doing different? Or would you do it the same way, actually? And reason why. Sometimes people do not follow the rule book because the rules are impeding their actual performance, right? And sometimes we can discover these things in that reflection, okay? So what helps us be in more harmony, have better harmony in our group? So it's all about giving people time to do things with what they're doing or learning or reading or engaging with, and reflecting on their own being.
Right.
How would you connect that? How, if you were in that person's place, right? And then there's the movement. The body needs to move. And if you bring, even in e-learning, if you bring that verbs into your learning message, that's something critical for me that I love doing. That is my favorite part of e-learning. I don't like the graphic part and all that. That's not my skill. I love getting the content and working on the message that will communicate that content to the learner, and then use those verbs that have to do with movement. So picture yourself in that place of this person. There's no passive learning there, because the mind, the neurons, we call them the mirror neurons. When you think about swimming, for example, which is your brain actually feels the movement of swimming, right? So if you use that type of vocabulary, you're actually helping the learner embody the process. Once the process is embodied, there you are.
So there's a way that your design is instilling this from the outset. So it's almost a prerequisite to engage, is to engage in reflection and to reflect upon self. And that's the beginning of eliciting some kind of inner dimension in your work. Am I hearing that correctly?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's exactly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Wonderful. I think we'll probably go for 5 more minutes, and I'm kind of interested in the shift, and I think this is happening in a lot of progressive learning, is the teacher traditionally has been at the board with all the knowledge, the information, and disseminates and kind of writes it on there for students to imbibe and repeat back as if they've learned. But this is shifting now. Shifting to teachers being more on the side and encouraging the learners to own the experience. Can you talk about that shift in your work, where you're less the expert with the chalk telling people what to do?
Yeah, that's still a little bit hard, because teachers are afraid of not being the experts, right?
Right. Okay.
And they need to learn together, right? To engage in that learning and discovery process. And something that happened once, that a teacher told me, Monica, because one thing that I think is very important when you're doing learning is to have an instructional designer with you.
Right.
I think teachers are doing these alone, and that's not good at all. Teachers have been alone or on their own for so long, and there's so many details that go into the learning process that cannot be done by just one person. It's teamwork. And with e-learning, having an instructional designer with you, it's great. Well, even if it's not an instructional designer, if it's a colleague that you can share what you're doing and you're thinking of doing with that colleague, and kind of go back and forth on the design of your course, that helps a lot.
Right.
Because we can ponder things. And I remember that I was working with a person, and she was telling me, Monica, I never thought this could be done. I had read about this competence learning based processes, and I always thought, yeah, but never realized that you could actually bring this into reality, making people do things and then tell them, look, this is what we're achieving. We're trying to get here through this activity. It's just a pretext, if we can call it that way. The whatever we're doing in the learning arena, it's for something else that is deeper, right?
Right.
We're not doing this activity per se. It's just to achieve this other higher skill. And that higher skill, I think, is something that we also need to bring our learners, because it's natural, or that's how we've been taught, that you need to tell the student what are the objectives of the lesson, right? But to me, it's a lot more inspiring if you tell the person, okay, this is what you will become after you finish this course, right?
Yeah.
Because it builds into your identity.
Right.
We're not just achieving small objectives. We're becoming, we're transforming in every learning opportunity. We are no longer the same person afterwards. If we engage deeply, of course, because that's what I was saying. You bring a lot in, you process it, and then you bring it out, and then you're a different person.
So you're growing students and also teachers, from the sounds of it, into their own becoming. So it's all sort of part of the natural growth process of the human spirit, rather than accomplishments in a way. What I think you're saying, almost achieving stuff in some ways can block it, can block this continuous growth, continuous process of growth, is what I'm hearing anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yes, because they get used to just small things.
Yeah.
And out there, not inside.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Monica. I think I'm going to draw it to a close there. I'm going to unpin you, but I think I'm going to change the schedule I mentioned slightly. So I'm just going to unpin you.